Hello and welcome to Android Developers Backstage. I'm Chet Haas on the graphics team.
I'm Tor Norby on the Android Studio team.
I'm Romain on the Toolkit team, and I would like to add that, Chet, you're not on the graphics team anymore.
Wow. Fast forward a few weeks, I am on the UI Toolkit team. Yep, correction noted.
All right, moving on. Next guest.
I am Siva. I'm on the Android Studio team.
I'm Sandhya. I'm also on the Android Studio team.
All right, Android Studio Day. This is exciting.
Oh, no, I'm out. We're doing tools again? Again? Didn't we do tools recently?
Haven't we covered everything by now?
Cover tools early, cover tools often. And we have an exciting topic today. Studio Bot. So we just launched this a couple days ago, I think at this point, at I.O. So we have the TL for the feature and the PM for the feature here. So what is Studio Bot?
So I can go. Studio Bot is an AI coding assistant. It'll be in your Android Studio and it'll help you with best practices, can answer questions for you, and hopefully it'll be a good assistant for you.
Okay, so we're talking about IDEs now, not like general, like, hey, create me a resume, right?
That's correct.
So give me a better idea of what you do within an IDE in that context.
That sounds like a good question. Studio Bot can help you with coding questions. So if you're in the middle of your programming and you have a question about a best practice or what an API is, or remind me how to do this, Studio Bot can help you there.
Okay, so like, should I have a semicolon at the end of this thing? Are you asking general questions? Are you asking code examples? Are you saying fill in, refactor this code for me? Like, how far does this go?
A lot of that can work. Studio Bot can help you with a lot of those. So with coding questions, with best practices, and generate code for you. Also help you with like documentation, test cases, and so on.
Can you do things like, for instance, sometimes you read code that was left uncommented by the engineer? Is that something where the assistant or the bot can help explain what the code does?
Yeah, I think that's a really good use case. A lot of times we're just maintaining legacy code. We've seen, there's very little new code being written in large enterprises, and Studio Bot can really help you there by explaining a piece of code. As in, let's just say you come in and you want to know what this does. You don't have to figure it out. Studio Bot can help you with, here's a quick summary of what this function does or what this program does.
In fact, we the specific thing you asked about, can help me document my code. We actually have that specific feature built where you can select your code and say add comments to this. And it does that. Now, we did actually pull it from the build that was just released, although it'll appear back in a Canary. And it was just because there were some unpredictable results in some cases.
Can you put it back so Chet can start using it?
There's a flag. If you know the magical flag, you can turn it back on, right?
Actually,
so then what it does is it actually gives you this action which adds the comments and it opens up a diff window. So you can sort of see what it did and you can say, yeah, that comment looks good, or I want to rewrite this one. Anyway, so that'll make a reappearance in a Canary build soon.
I was thinking we should just set it loose on the entire Android source base because we still have a lot of uncommented APIs in there. So
actually, this is a good point to bring up. Some of these things, we don't know where the product should eventually go to, because what's the point of asking the model to write a comment if any developer at any point in time can just look at the source code and say, can you tell me what's going on? So why do you have to ask it and put it in the code? Or why do you have to go through this step of, go document all of this? Instead, eventually you want it to be smart and say, you ask a snippet and it gives you the details that you want as opposed to all the generic details. And you may be in a different stage than the person who wrote it.
If you want the AI to feel like a real person, like real intelligence, you really need to document your getters by saying like, get foo, returns the foo.
It's interesting how it's able to guess based on the method name sometimes actually what the method really does, which is so it's not just saying returns the foo variable. Often it'll kind of make an interpretation. But let's get a bit more concrete on what the feature is. So it's an assistant. Well, what does that mean? Like what do I go in the tool? Do I get like a little paperclip that says, how can I help you today? Like, what does the feature look like?
I would say that's definitely one of our inspirations going into this, going back to like Clippy from a long time ago. So right now, Studio Bot is a tool window in which you can have conversations, and it almost feels like you can have a natural language conversation and get the code or advice that you need.
So it's like a chatbot.
That is correct. Yeah.
I was going to say it's a chatbot. It's a chat bot integrated into the IDE.
But do we have like a Clippy animation? Because that would be so cool, right?
Unfortunately, trademark reasons. But we do have a cute little Android figure in there.
Yeah, and I think it is a very big philosophical difference, right? Is that I think Clippy, my impression of it, I never used it, but it was watching what you were doing and making suggestions. And StudioBot, I think, is very deliberately not doing that, right? It is one of the things we've heard from our users is, I don't have permission from my lawyers to have Google see my source code, right? So it has to be secret. So StudioBot is very deliberately not sending stuff to Google unless you put it in the chatbot window. Like that is, I think, a key differentiator here, right? Is that this is a bit like opening a Chrome tab and you can put something into the search query, but the IDE isn't going to upload your source code. StudioBot's the exact same thing, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. Just to summarize and just restate the view, I would say StudioBot, it's a chat bot integrated as a tool window in the IDE. You open it, you ask it it's like having a conversation with an assistant. That's the eventual plan we want to have. You can have whatever type of conversation you want to have. You can ask it about your code. The only thing that actually gets sent to Google is what you explicitly ask in the StudioBot. So nothing else. StudioBot does not know anything else. So whatever you ask goes to Google. We have the backend model serving a response, and then that shows up as a response in the tool window. And then we have a whole bunch of smart actions based on those responses. So we actually have things going both ways. You can either initiate a conversation by explicitly typing text, or through various surfaces inside the IDE. From the editor, you can ask it to comment on your code. If you have a crash in Logcat, you can say, tell me about this crash. You have a Gradle sync failure. You can say, what is going on here? And so there are nicer ways to ask the question. When the response comes back, there are certain responses on which you want to act upon. Like if there's a code, maybe you want to pull it back into the editor. You want to play around with it. So there are some of these smart actions. So that's kind of what the Studio was.
So that's what the value this adds on top of if you were to open a browser tab and talk to, for example, Google's Bard.
That's right.
So if I use one of those smart actions, let's say I select code and I want to ask the bot to comment it, does it send that into the conversation, or does it act on it immediately?
That's a good question. So what we do is we copy the code, we paste it in the conversation window, and then we let you decide, do you want to send it or not? So, at the end of the day, you have to press enter. Anytime you are sending your custom data, we don't automatically send it. We post the custom message with the prompt into the editor, into the chatbot, in the input box, and then it's up to you to decide whether you want to send it or not.
Okay, so that's I'm going to rewind and replay again, because the thing that Tor mentioned kind of caused a flag for me on behalf of the universe, which was, oh wait, so if I start having conversations, all of a sudden my company's code is uploaded. But what you're saying is no. So like I wondered the same thing. Like when I'm typing into the bot, is it looking for context in the code in the editor window that it's next to? And the answer is no. It's only using whatever you give it as input into the query, and then that's going to go up to the servers and do its magic and then send the answer back.
We think that's a big differentiator actually, because most of the existing products are all, they use up everything in your IDE. This one doesn't. We pay very strict attention to that, and we made sure that the only thing we send are things that you see and you explicitly send.
Okay.
So any enterprise should be able to use it.
Yeah, I mean, we're working on other ML features too, like code completion, and we'll have that, right? But with code completion, obviously it's sending your editor contents. And that really muddies the water a lot, which is why we're like, right now we're focusing on this so you can really understand that you are in control and you don't have to opt into sharing, which for a lot of our developers are really, really important.
I mean, I like the idea of it not looking at my current code, because if I'm asking a question, I obviously don't know what I'm doing to begin with. So ignore the code to the left and just give me an answer on the right that's probably going to be more correct than whatever I
mean, often the things I'm asking is not about the code. It's I'm about to do something. I'm like, hey, I need to format, I need to get the current time in the user's locale, for example. How do I do that? What is the formatting string for that exactly? And I'd ask questions like that. And there are many other types of questions too, like what should I name this thing? Or there's just all kinds of.
Can we call it Bike Shed? Really? Can we? Because we could just have that conversation forever on what we should name something. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
think a solid use case is remind me how to do something.
Yeah.
You should never use StudioBot and to find answers for things that you don't know or don't understand. It's only for use cases where you can actually play around with it. It might not work directly out of the box. You'd have to adapt it a little bit, adapt it a little bit to your scenario to make it work for you.
and so what are the kind of the limits of what StudioBot does? Clearly, it can answer questions about API documentation, naming things,
Mhm.
code. Can I ask it to generate an icon for me? Like, can it do that, or is it purely text?
Right now, the current versions are purely text. It can only respond back in text. The UI can only show text. In fact, so the response is actually marked down, and we format the markdown, but there are restrictions to how much we do in the markdowns.
What if I ask for ASCII art?
Or emojis. Emojis get really graphical.
I think it can probably do ASCII art. I'm
Yeah.
not sure. I have not asked the question.
Well, we have something related to this, which are slash commands. Do you remember IRC
Mm-hmm.
back in the day? When you could type /me blah blah blah, and it would basically like tell everyone what you were doing.
Or slash Jiffy in the case of Slack.
Yeah, so slash commands are a thing, and so we've added some of those too, and so those can actually operate on non-text things. They can initiate refactorings or setting breakpoints or things like that, right? So we're trying to make the whole command line interface a bit more useful. Like if you're going to start typing in this place, maybe you can accomplish certain IDE actions too.
So do you have an example of a slash command and how you would use it? Does it use the AI itself, or is it just a shortcut for things that are already in the IDE?
Well, there's several types of them, right? So there's some that are just helpful with the bot. So like the one I use the most is /clear, right? Which is just like, okay, give me a new start, right? Or /save or screenshot, which you're just sort of capturing the history, which is kind of helpful sometimes, right? Especially if you want to file a bug. But then there's others that are actually operating on the IDE level. So I mentioned some like, setting breakpoints, for example, right? And that'll use your code index. So you're actually getting to do some composite commands that are harder to do via clicking on things, right? So you can, for example, say /debug, and you can name a class. That'll find that class, find its entry point, launch debugger into that class, for example.
But I think half of what Romain asked for, do the slash commands use the AI models? I don't think, at least the current set of slash commands don't. They are purely in IDE local commands.
Yeah.
Actually, it sounds like you saw a text field and you're like, oh, we can do more with that text field that has nothing to do with the bot.
Well, the idea is that sometimes I think that, you want to be able to have ways of directing things. So, for example, clearing the history without necessarily having to go and right click on something. But I think over time, we'll also have the IDE respond to more of the model thing. So there's a handful of things it already responds to. So if you, for example, if you ask for a naming suggestion, it'll actually annotate that with follow-up actions, right? That'll take action on that.
So Tor, what would be really great to clear the history without typing /clear is the same shortcut that works in other parts of the IDE. Like it's Command K, right? In Logcat in the terminal.
Sure. Should it clear the text field history or the entire timeline history?
Well, whatever /clear does.
Okay, so this is the feature request portion of the podcast.
Yeah,
Anybody? Anybody got any others? Bugs are good too.
Do we do this feature request is horrible part of the podcast? Or
Actually, I'd like to go back to the slash commands. The reason it's important is that it's like having a natural language conversation with your IDE. And if you think about the early days of AI, it was a race to the bottom of your brainstem, as in like TikTok and giving you that quick dopamine rush, getting you to feel like the product is more sticky. I think with the AI chatbots of this generation, it's about getting to your heart. So trying to have that really good conversation with you so that you feel like you're getting what you need. And at the same time, it's a great experience.
I'm trying to imagine a conversation with someone in my family where I issue the same thing as a slash thing where I just say, okay, now shut up now because I want to say something new, right? I'm /clear.
Forget the /chat. It's /go do the dishes.
And I don't think that bot is going to work for me in my home life. So yeah, some things yet to be done. Okay, so I get sort of the overview. So now can you help me understand how this thing actually works? So you've got some method that you just wrote, and wouldn't it be nice if we could have the bot comment that thing, assuming people want comments in their code or documentation for APIs? How does that work? Okay, so this is getting into more of the AI portion of it, where some information gets sent up there and then magic happens. So what's the magic happening for StudioBot?
Um, it's nothing brand new or surprising. There is an LLM. An LLM is a large language model, and the large language model it's trained on a whole bunch of data. So given a certain what is called a prompt, which is the input, you could consider your input to be the prompt. This goes into the language model, and the language model essentially tries to predict what comes after this input. And then there are many ways to optimize this language model. So we have a language model on the back end. So when you start from whatever example that you came up with, the question that you posed, that question gets packaged, it gets sent over to the backend. The backend feeds it to the language model. In the backend, actually, there are two parts. We can go into that next. There's one part called the verified responses, and then there's the part that goes into the language model. The language model receives it, and that's where the magic happens. Nobody really fully understands the language model.
It's my favorite part of all this stuff.
So it's people are spending millions, probably billions into this, but it's not there at a place where it's a black box.
This might be a good place to have a shout out to our partner teams inside of Google, like Ada, right? So we're using their technology, which is based on, I think Sandhya has got more of a clue exactly what it is.
Absolutely. So Google built these foundation models, and the Ada team kind of adapted that to code-specific use cases. And so it's kind of the best in class that's used across Google, and we're not reinventing a lot of that for Android Studio. And it'll also power other surfaces across Google. And so we're really excited to work with them, and we want to thank them for all of their help along this journey.
This is where we would play the sound effect for like some sort of audience applause, but we don't have that yet.
Yeah, so we were very excited to work with them. So it's been great.
Yeah, and going back to LLMs, the way I describe it to a 5-year-old is just,
like me. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's good. It's definitely a good choice in analogy. Yeah.
It's just how would you complete peanut butter and
fish
and grapes?
Right.
Yeah,
okay,
I got it.
Yep.
3 years.
Okay.
You had to go lower.
Okay. So back to the example where it's like, okay, well, I got a method that, returns a value of, a function to compute Fibonacci or whatever. Like, that's a little more complicated in my mind, at least, than peanut butter and fish. So is it actually walking through the code and sort of figuring out what's going on, or is it looking at just the barest information, like here's the name of a method and I was asked to write a comment around the name of a method and make some assumptions about that? Like what is that model?
Going back to the point we made earlier, when you send that code snippet saying add comments, we send nothing else. So there is no other code for it to inspect.
Yep.
Like it's very, very clear that this is all you get. But then there's some sort of smarts in there. This is the part that we don't really understand, where it can actually do a pretty impressive. It doesn't have to have seen, your question can be like, add comments to this. And it might not have seen that exact code snippet before. It's not just regurgitating something it saw before. There's some, I hesitate to use the word reasoning, right? But there's something that happens where it actually is constructing code snippets that make sense. Often.
That's true. I think that's the generative capability of the LLMs, which it's been trained on pretty much every piece of information in the open internet. So it's able to generate the content that we need for our use case.
So it is trained on both text and code. So it knows a lot of the general knowledge that is there floating around on the internet. And because it has seen pretty much all the code there is on, let's say, GitHub, it knows that these sequences of tokens correspond to doing these kinds of actions. So in some sense, and this is the part that I certainly don't understand, but it's still very much a research topic. What they have found out is as they scale up these language models to be bigger and bigger, and these are in the multi-billion number of parameters. I think ours is like over 20 billion or so. They get to generalize and almost reason, like it feels like real reasoning, which is multi-step reasoning, not just a single step of looking at this and saying, oh, usually this means that, but it can put together multiple pieces from throughout the input that you feed to it. And based on that, it generates a particular suffix. So in this response, in your question, you suggested adding documentation to a method.
Yep.
In which case it will see the full method text, right? And then from its knowledge of having seen similar patterns in the past across various other pieces of code, it can generalize to say, okay, this is probably what you're trying to do here.
I guess the thing that's interesting to me with StudioBot in particular is whenever people talk about AI and large language models, it's more about like what's the next word that would make sense in this context. But we're not talking about words. We're talking about programming, algorithm logic in this code. Is it looking that deeply? Does it understand actually what's happening in the code, or is it still just looking at the language that we're handing to it?
Yeah, I would say it's still a large language model. It's not a knowledge model.
Yeah.
So I think that's the approach.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And to be clear, the studio team, we're not the ones doing the ML, right? So the big thing we're doing is adding all this integration on top of it. So, we get these code fragments back. We're the ones who are figuring out what is the language and how do we parse this and how do we add these actions. So, for example, the add documentation action, we get back the code with the comments, and we're the ones who are then trying to line that up with the current. And that's where we're using actual parsing, right? Like, okay, here's this method body that should be lined up with this one over there, and we can do the smart application. So there's a bunch of static analysis that happens on the studio side. The ML, we're kind of leaving it to the experts.
Just to follow up on what you're saying, Chet, you're using the word, but Siva used token. And my understanding, right, is that a token can be less or more than a word.
That's right.
So I think to answer your question, Chet, it's not that it's looking, for the word as we understand it. It's something else. It's a different unit of prediction.
Okay. That's more of just the way the current ML systems are done. They take a word and they kind of split it into chunks. Usually a token could be like 3 to 4 characters. But you could say that's also very much a research topic. It's the current models right now split the input sequence into a set of tokens for efficiency reasons primarily. And then you are right. It is still just predicting the next word. It has just been tuned to generate things that we like and generate things that make sense to us. So given a certain kind of prompt and an input, it generates this particular response. Now, we should talk about the prompt because there is one thing we missed, which is when you say document this method, the method body is what you pass in as input. But in addition to the method body, we add a prompt at the top. And this is what, all through the internet, you will hear talk about how do you prompt LLMs and what kinds of prompts to use. So in this particular case, we add a certain prompt, which is specific to documentation, where we say, it's as simple as saying, document this in, I don't know exactly what prompt we have for this one, but you look through a few prompts, figure out what kind of prompt actually works to generate the output that you want. Documentation it's an interesting example where you send the method body, and then you want to see the documentation embedded inside, let's say before each line of code, for instance. You don't want the LLM to say, here's your code, and then just say line 1, line 2, line 1 does this, line 2. This is not very predictable. You can't really control LLMs in the sense of saying always produce exactly this style of output. So there is a lot of work that has to happen when you get the response back to see from this response, how can you actually merge back the return documentation back into the code. So that's some of the smart, you could say smart actions that we do.
So you use the word predictable, and that's actually a question I had. If I ask the same question twice to StudioBot, do I get the same answer every time? Or because I've used assistants before, assistant-like things, and you ask the same question, and you don't get the same answer. I'm like, I remember I saw the answer I liked. I want it back, please.
Was it Einstein's definition of insanity if you're expecting a different answer every time you ask the same question?
Well, in this case,
if I ask you a question not towards Chet, something about a graphics API, which graphics API should I use? You probably will not say exactly the same words all the time. You will mix it up. The concepts are going to be the same. The effective content will be the same, but it doesn't mean that you're going to do exactly the same sentence. And if I ask you to write code, for sure, you're not going to write exactly verbatim the same names, whatever, right? And so, again, it's not that this is good or bad. It's more of it's the current state of technology where this is based on how you decode the output from the model, and that relies on a few probabilistic settings.
Yeah, so sometimes the answers we get, aren't exactly what we'd like. So we have this verified mechanism. Can you talk about what that is?
So there are certain questions for which we know factually what the answer is. One thing language models are not good at is responding to just facts. They are trained. The training was done sometime in the past. They don't have any new knowledge since the training. So a good example of this would be something like, what is the latest version of Compose?
Or what time is it?
Or what day is it? It doesn't know any of those details. So there are certain things that we can parse, and we know that, okay, this is what you're talking about, in which case we decide that, okay, this is something that we can respond. And so we show that visually in a distinctive way. At the end of the response, we show you the language model's response, and then at the end, we also show you a verified response. And there are times when we decide, for this question, there is no point in showing the language model's response, so we'll just show you the verified response. So that is the verified response.
Yeah, I'd say I can add a little bit more to that. In general, I think one of the issues with LLMs is the ability to hallucinate, where it comes up with its own answer, but it's very confident that this is the right answer when we know, obviously, this is way off from what the real answer is. And so to handle that, we have the verified responses feature in StudioBot, which is using a fact server to surface the answers where we know for a fact that the answer that's provided by the LLM is incorrect.
Especially if it's an important question we think Android developers will ask, right? So one of them is like, is Jetpack Compose production ready? Someone might answer that, and the large language model might base its answer on its earlier training where Compose was in a different state than it is now. And we want to sort of give the official answer if you're asking that, which we think Android developers will. And that's when the fact server comes in, right? So you sort of get both what the bot thinks and you get what we think. And one of them is tagged as like human edited.
But it's not just about the freshness of the data it was trained on, right? Like, if I understand, Shiva, what you're describing about LLMs, there's no guarantee that it's going to give you the fact as the answer. Like, for instance, if the training corpus, like that fact was studied once on all of the internet, probabilistically, you're not going to get that answer. But so, yeah. So I'm glad that we have, that fact database.
So it kind of goes to the quality of the models and the importance or relevance of some of those questions. So if you think about version questions, for instance, it's obvious that the language model will never catch up to knowing what is the latest version of any particular library. But other things, like you wanted to write a program, you could say it's probabilistic and it'll never write me the same method to compute something. But it does a pretty good job that there is no reason for us to go and interject and say, we need to come up with a verified response. Otherwise, it'll probably end up, then it'll just be a search engine, right? So there is this, I guess, trade-off.
Like, I think this is where, having that text interface is good. Like, now you can ask StudioBot, like, what's the latest version of Studio? What's the latest version of AGP, Kotlin, like all of it. We hit all the different version servers and look it up. And I don't actually know where to get that information today. If I want to know the latest version of Android X, I have to go to developer.android.com and try to, it's hard. And this is by far the easiest way to look it up, I think, for some of these things. And so that's like, even though it's a text field that we kind of overloaded with, we can hit the servers here. We're not going to ask the large language model, because the large language model generally will give you the wrong answer. We don't hide it because I think it's good for people to understand there's a generated answer that's not always correct. But that's what it's for.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to add some data points to that. We've noticed from our internal productivity studies that developers spend around 4.5 hours every week on information seeking, and that's way more than the actual time spent on coding, which is only 3.5 hours a week. So imagine if we could be there as StudioBot trying to synthesize all the information for them, provide them the answers, right? We are saving them a few hours every week, right?
So engineers are only working 3.5 hours a week?
What I'm hearing is 32 hours.
Who did you sample for this?
32 hours of drinking coffee. That's pretty much it. Okay.
Yes, I think a lot of time spent in like meetings
Podcasts.
and just figuring out what needs to be done in that coding
How to
time
name
and so on.
things.
So yeah,
I think there's some truth in that. I think people have been very excited about code completion for AI and, oh, look, it saves me some typing, right? But to me, what I really like about this is when I have a question and instead of trying to like trawl my way through a bunch of search results, especially like this week, actually, I was asking some specific questions about language syntax and it involved symbols. And usually those are very hard to find in search engines. But the LLM is pretty good at it. So I can ask like, hey, what does this operator mean in C++, for example? And it provided me, I got straight to the answer. And out of curiosity, I tried going to search engine and it was much harder to find the same result.
It reminds me of what I found great about IDEs like IntelliJ and Android Studio. It was less about, I can rename this thing or I have code completion. It was more, it analyzes my code and tells me what I'm doing wrong sometimes. It's like, hey, if you're using X and you're sending it to Y, you're probably making a mistake. And that saves a lot more time than, code completing my get.
Yeah. To be clear, we're not doing that. We're not doing the proactive guidance yet. It's like whatever you type in the query. But to me, like when I'm stuck on something, like finding out how do I do datetime formatting is it's much more to me about that, where I can explicitly state what I want. I don't want it to like guess from my comment before this code completion what it is I'm trying to do. I can say, please write this and give me a unit test. And I sort of get both.
I get that. My point was, it helps you at the higher level, which is where you save the most time.
Yeah, good point.
I think most importantly, though, that it's going to save all engineers from having to interact with people. Which is really sort of where we were trying to take our careers to begin with when we first got into computers. So it's fantastic.
To be clear, StudioBot is intended for coding. Google has other products like Bard, like write peer evaluation for Chet. I'm gonna see how it does.
So I had a question about this, though, that it seems like to figure out for StudioBot in particular, to figure out whether there should be a verified response or whether we're going to trust the thing coming back from the servers, you need to have a fair amount of intelligence just going into puzzling out what the prompt was to begin with. If someone's asking you for documentation, they're not going to say it in the same way every time. Or if they're asking for, the latest version of something, like the words that they use are going to be somewhat random. So how do you get to the essence of that to figure out what the actual prompt was?
It's interesting that these things are becoming simpler. It's not that we have the best model for understanding your intent right now, but what we have is fairly decent. And what is going on is it takes your prompt and then does some sort of an approximate match. So we first, we call it semantic search. But essentially what it does is it tries to understand the meaning of your sentence. And as long as you've flipped a few different words, they could, you could have used a synonym or something like that. It understands that, okay, for this database that I have, this question very closely matches something that I know. And so it's somewhat of an approximate match.
So we use AI for that too. So what
that was what I was getting at, was like, this also is something that you send to the servers because that's where the models are that can divine what the actual question is.
True.
Right?
So, except for the version checks, because those are really actually all happening on the studio side. Those are not going to the fact server.
Okay, but then you still need to figure out how they're asking for version.
You're going to be excited to know how this works.
Chet, if only there was a company that has spent the past 25 years trying to understand what you asked.
The company, sure, but how does this work in the actual IDE, right? Like, we're not in Google search here. We are in Android Studio.
In the back end, to get into a tiny bit more technical detail, what people do in general is, again, nothing new on the ML side of it, but the approach is something simple. What we do is we convert every word into a vector. And a vector is just a sequence of numbers. And that's because computers only process numbers. They don't process textual data.
Now I get it.
And the thing about these vectors is that this mapping, which they call embedding, is trained to put similar words together. So in your huge vector space, words that are similar and usually occur in the same context end up in similar spaces. And so then it just becomes, you have two vectors and you compute how close they are. You just use something called a cosine similarity. You just look at the cosine angle between them. And that's about it. And we find whichever one is the closest. So getting back to graphics, huh?
Yeah. I love the fact that we took like a really complicated language problem and we boiled it down to ninth grade geometry.
I was not
Yes,
expecting a multi-dimensional dot product as part of this text interface.
No one expects that.
So all you kids in school right now, pay attention to geometry. It's going to matter. All right, brought that to a halt.
But it is, what Tor brought up is that some of these searches are handled entirely locally inside the IDE, and some are handled in the backend. Even in these verified responses, we have two different ways of doing it. You could argue it's more what is happening right now. I don't think this is how it will be in the future. It could also, and so whatever is happening locally in the IDE is more programmatic. We do small searches within just what you enter, and so it is not going to be magical. What goes into the backend is a tiny bit more magical. In the future, we can totally see how we could potentially bring that into the IDE too. So I would say currently that's what's happening.
So do you also see, so there were IDE actions that you could take like outside of the chat bot window, the studio bot window. I assume that you're looking at other things that you could do throughout the IDE, like how can we take the core fundamentals that you're working on and sort of spread it into the overall IDE experience? Is that the direction of things?
The current principle, again, is to not leak anything of the users, right? So it's much more like the example Siva gave was in, for example, Logcat. When there's a crash, we put like a little ask studio bot about this crash action in there.
Yeah.
And when you click it, we will then extract the most important parts of the stack frame and create a query from it. I think it's totally feasible and probably likely that one day, if you've said, yes, share my code with Google, we could start doing a lot more proactive guidance, right? But right now, we're just really, since we know that a lot of our developers, are not going to be comfortable with sharing code permissions, we're really focusing on that part, not the proactively running stuff in the background and offering guidance.
Oh, I have a feature request. I hit this one this morning for a while, which was, when you have an old project and then you open it and it no longer builds because something in the universe changed. And it's a combination of Compose versions, Kotlin versions, library versions, Gradle versions, and all these things interacting in really horrible ways. What I'd really like is to ask a bot somewhere, just upgrade the project so it builds. Could I inject that as a feature?
Yeah, I mean, actually, like when I said earlier that probably we will start tying actions more to the responses, that is exactly what I meant.
Okay.
Right. So if the bot says, hey, here's how you do this in Studio and here's 7 steps, we could totally understand what those are and actually perform them for you. But the use case you just mentioned of, I tried to open an old project and I get this sync error. That's exactly where we think. In fact, this was the first inspiration for the verified answers. It's, if we suddenly break something, new version of AGP comes out, it's incompatible with something, and this actually happened with Kotlin. Kotlin came out and there was some sort of breakage with, so get this brand new error. The LLM has not seen this before, but we know lots of people will ask about it because they'll all get the same sync error. And they'll hit Studio and ask, what is this? And we could totally react and go, okay, a lot of people are hitting this. We can provide a verified answer for this. So it'll actually respond much quicker. And obviously there's all these other use cases too for these other topics, but that is really where I think there's a huge value in responding to error messages, because we know that error messages are one of the top things people are searching for.
Mm-hmm.
And so by having this integrated with the sync window, with the output window, with the logcat window, even internal IDE errors will generate this. And the biggest shock I had was how good of a job the LLM did explaining crashes. Like this was before it had any training on these things. And it's still just like from background learning, it does a really, really good job.
I assume it just sent down like a shruggy emoji. So I assume that the verified answers are also coming from the server, which means that we can have updated information that doesn't require people to constantly update their IDE to get these verified responses.
That's right. It is a server round trip.
Yep. Nice. Okay, so that's it. Do we know everything?
I'm looking forward to the day that StudioBot can look at the entire project and just tell me, you should give up programming.
Well, I assume the next time
Here are some of the career ideas for you.
My next time I open the project, it will actually just rewrite my code entirely. It's going to look at it and just get sort of however machines get nauseous, and then it's just going to refactor everything.
Are you saying I can replace you with the StudioBot?
I'm not. I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about what you can reasonably expect. I feel like
that's
It's always the
boring.
voice of reason.
I feel like I should put in a few caveats here. I don't know if we're getting close to the end, but if we are,
Caveat away.
I think for at least till the end of the year, we see this as being in Canary only. We need to make sure that the responses are accurate enough to a level that we decide it's good enough to be promoted to stable. It is true that our vision is that this gives you the perfect recommendations for what you should do or how you should architect your project, for instance, or any general Android guidance that we have. We wanted to follow all the the modern Android development style, but right now it's more of internet consensus, shall we say. So we need to be careful.
So it's rude and slightly wrong in very difficult to diagnose ways.
You should expect that. You should expect to closely look at what it is saying before you adopt any of its practices. There are a number of areas where it's doing a fantastic job. And I think it's already proving to be quite helpful just in our day-to-day development, especially in things like how do I use a particular API? You just want to see some code sample as a beginning for your experimentation. I think it does a fantastic job for that. But I would say at this point, you should be cautious. And you should be cautious of every language model that you interact with. This is not a limitation that is specific to ours. I think that this is true.
Yeah, we have some cautionary text right there in the UI, permanently sitting next to the text field to sort of make people aware to not, even though you might think, hey, StudioBot from the Android Studio team, you should know about Android. The way this technology is, it's not always going to give the right answers, right? So we want to make people really clear on that, not just blindly copy paste answers and trust it.
I think that's why, like in some of the examples we've seen out in the wide world outside of StudioBot, where it just messes up simple things like math. Actually, they just injected that on purpose to give you the right expectation. Because if they're going to mess that up, then, what else are they not getting wrong?
Well, it's funny. Someone said, hey, like you have these verified answers for versions. Why are you even showing the generated answer? And I think it's good that we are showing it so you understand the technology. You're seeing the generated response, which is reasonable often, but it's usually not the latest version. So you understand, okay, that's the generated response and here's the verified response. And I think if we were hiding that, it might just make it less clear, the correctness level.
All right. So maybe we're at the portion where we say, so how do people try this? You said Canary channel.
Yes.
Well, first, yeah. I think for Canary, we want to make it really clear that this is an early experiment.
Canaries are the first ones to die in the coal mine, just to be clear.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's available in the Canary channel.
And it is currently US only. So unfortunately, if you're not in the US, you won't be able to try it yet. And that's not something we can do anything about.
And go out and try it. And feedback, is there a feedback mechanism or, file feedback that generates the bug report? Is that basically it?
Use it. I think for every response, there is it's a common trend in the internet nowadays. There's a thumbs up, thumbs down signal. If you can, click on those buttons. Let us know which ones are bad. But you are welcome to provide feedback in whatever way that is easiest for you. If it makes sense to file a bug. If it makes sense to make fun of it in Twitter, go for it.
I would say I don't think the bug should be for like, hey, this answer is incorrect. I think for that, up and down buttons. I think the bug tracker should be for like the part Studio did. The, hey, this code action, I clicked on, insert into, merge into file, and it did something weird. Like those are the things that we can act on. I think for the up and down buttons are for the actual model things, and we will use those to help. For example, like if lots and lots of people are asking a certain question and lots of people are voting it down, maybe that needs a verified answer for now, for example, right?
Can I ask StudioBot to write the bug for me?
No.
Because that would be super helpful.
Some of the things actually that we want to add in the future, maybe we shouldn't speak so much about future things. This one is very simple. We want StudioBot to be able to diagnose Studio itself. So just to understand, why is Studio slow? We should be able to look at Studio, get thread dumps, or point you to bugs, things like that.
Upgrade Gradle correctly. Yeah. Okay. Just putting that feature request in there again. All right.
Take
Anything
a
else?
step back. I do feel like it's truly the best of times. The team has worked itself into a fever pitch of excitement, and we're really hoping that everyone will like this product.
It's very trendy. It's very exciting. I am curious to see what people make of it.
I'm excited because I feel like I've been using it myself and I find a lot of value in it. And it's true that you often have to go and like, that's not the right answer. But overall, just, generally, it seems to really unblock me a lot faster than finding information the other way. And so I think just based on that alone, it sort of passes the dog food test. Like there's some value there. Anything we forgot to ask?
No, I think I'm excited to see what the reaction is. I really don't know. So
let us know. All right. Thanks.